That is a very good one, specifically because the concept of success when I was probably even as a medical student or what I thought I wanted to be down the line has evolved substantially, especially as I've gotten into, not just deeper into my practice, but also deeper into my life with a family. And I think that if I look back at my time during those earlier days, certainly success revolved around perhaps publication numbers, this leadership positions, even as I got into consulting for industry, and kind of bolstering the CV, right? With the CV being kind of the litmus test of the more robust it is, the better I've done, if you will, as an internal metric. It wasn't until, I'll put it this way, my kind of work ethic has definitely been influenced by my family, especially my father in particular, and certainly by my brother, who's 5 years younger. And I think my brother and I both sort of took from our dad that, like, listen, you've got to keep grinding and grind and hustle and kind of, almost, act like you're about work, like you're behind. So that way you can not just, kind of accomplish things, but then continue pushing things forward. And so you can go into that sense of leadership. But, interestingly, I realized over time, and, I certainly realized, and I held on to that sort of mentality from med school through residency and even to early fellowship. And then when I eventually met my now wife, I realized, especially kind of seeing how committed she was, not just to her job as a nurse practitioner, but also as, how committed she was to her family, that the importance of trying to find a homeostasis or equilibrium of both becomes increasingly important. And so while now, fast forward almost 9, 10 years into practice, it's not so much about, like, yes, like I do obviously monitor, and especially with my institution, we have to monitor this, keep the CV updated and all that jazz. But I don't, I don't necessarily think that in my head, it's not what drives me as much anymore. What drives me is being able to support what I would consider more a marker of success is to what extent can I inspire and empower my son and daughter? To what extent can I be there for my wife and for our respective families? And that to me has really been the major shift where ultimately, and people ask me all the time, how do I sort of find the ability or equilibrium amongst everything going on? And I say, well, if family is number one, then everything else follows suit because it becomes that much easier to kind of figure out how best to parse out the time you need to get other things done while making your family the number one priority. And I would say that that's definitely been sort of perhaps the most radical change from when I was going through it, and not something I ever thought I would be saying, now, however many years later, and, now as a, practicing attending. I I actually would say that in a kind of a top level, the mentorship kind of capability or mentorship as sort of an umbrella term, I think has been sort of the place where have found my ability to not just connect with people, but really sort of help. I don't really want to say trailblaze, maybe sound a little bit too out there, but really help to pioneer some novel things associated with that. Some of which other guests may have spoken to or alluded to. Um, I found myself from the time I was in college through med school residency and even fellowship and even into early attendingship that I always wanted to give back because of challenges I had faced, because of the advice I'd gotten, good advice, not so great advice, and how do you sort of navigate the terrain as you're making your way through what is a very arduous journey, as we know. So sort of, with that, it was just a natural fit that I wanted to give back at every stage. And that's what I was trying to do. I was tutoring people in chemistry, as an example, in college. I was I served as a teaching assistant in some classes, and then I went on to do some similar type stuff as a med student. And then when I was a resident, I tried to corral, people together with the interest group involvement and, be kind of that resident bridge from the, student level to the department level in orthopedics. And it was just such a natural fit. And as I kind of progressed into practice, I realized that this was something that, okay, just kind of continued to come about. And so people wanted to spend time in clinic and didn't really have a great access point otherwise. And so I started becoming that, especially in Miami, where it was just so easy. The med school was right next to my clinic, so people could come in, or we could go do surgery at the outpatient center or at the main hospital, all of which was within walking distance. And that sort of, my ability to connect with people, my ability to be kind of real and transparent and honest, but also constructively critical as necessary, just became this sort of, it was a conduit really for being able to forge much longer term relationships, which I came to understand over time was, what mentorship was really about. And so as I started, quote unquote, hanging my hat on this notion, oh, hey, maybe this is something I'm doing, maybe this is something I can, quote unquote, spread the gospel of a little bit further, that is when I started taking, along with others, from across the US, hey, why don't we do this sort of via social media? Why don't, at a time where, especially in orthopedics, social media, digital technology was still very taboo for in a lot of circles. And as we started sort of pioneering, and I use that term loosely, hey, orthopedic presence in some capacity as it relates to student advising and mentorship, or even sort of really coaching, if you will, beyond the mentorship piece, the sort of online portal of Ortho Mentor, as it's been, come to be called as, started getting this traction. And I found myself, I'm like, I didn't necessarily need to fill that void of like doing, oh, I have to be a part of every society or every committee or whatever. I thought that, hey, I'm going to do this on my own terms with something that is near and dear to me, but based on things and experiences things I've gone through, things I've seen, experiences I've had, and to try to give back, not just at the local level at the institution I was at previously, but also at a, now national one, which is what the social media piece allowed me to do and allowed me to engage with folks, not just on the national, but, obviously as with you on an international level. And that has been perhaps one of the most rewarding, humbling, privilege-based experiences I have had to date. I find that it's an interesting question, and I paused and stuttered for a second because I think the most influential mentorship, kind of nugget of information I got was actually the one that sort of was the least helpful, to be honest. And I was finishing up my residency, and multiple people have heard me tell this story, but suffice to say, I was on a rotation that that during residency it just didn't click. I went into residency thinking that's what I was going to do with my life, and sure enough, that was what I just had the most trouble dealing with, believe it or not. And so it's now my chief year, and I'm definitely, I know things are not going well in with this particular attending. And I end up, just trying to pull that person aside. And I said, I think I literally said something to the effect of, I know things are not going great. Like, what can I do to improve? How can I improve moving forward? And the person said to me, I don't know I don't know how to help you. And that was perhaps, even though I don't consider this individual a mentor, that sort of advice, quote unquote, was perhaps that was perhaps the biggest catalyst for me to realize what I didn't want to carry forward, and especially at a time where, residency training is so tumultuous and it's very mentally, physically taxing. That's really a time that it could have gone one of two ways. I could have become very calloused as a result, or I could have become sort of inspired, by this to say, hey, I'm going to try to do better, or I'm going to try to improve upon the current state of affairs. And that was sort of the road I took, because I knew that, listen, I knew things that I was good at. I knew things I wasn't good at that time. And while even that has definitely evolved for the better, the reality is I knew that I was going to disrupt things, and I knew I had to change things, and I knew I had to just bide my time a little bit longer. So I would say that the feedback when given, if it's not, I mean, it's one thing to be critical, that's okay. It's another thing to be constructive, right? And the constructive aspect of the feedback really is what I think helps to separate the like real people who are just there in your life to serve as coaches, sort of on the fly, versus those who end up going on to be true mentors because they truly are trying to help guide you in a direction that's going to allow you to succeed. And while that may very well be on a spectrum, depending on who you talk to, the in this particular, this particular incident really showed me that the feedback had, if that person had said, "Hey, I don't know how to help you, but I'm going to let's think about it. Let's put our heads together and figure out. Let's maybe go over some cases. Let's do blank." I think it may have been a completely different sort of vibe thereafter, right? Versus this feeling that, okay, well, hell, now I'm on Lonely Island, and I'm like, okay, I don't even know like what to do until I get off of said place, right? And that to me is sort of perhaps one of the biggest differences with how I try to approach people and how some of the best mentors I've observed, either I've had and been lucky to have them in my life, or I've observed them with others, are. I think it's also the transparency piece is really important, right? People don't want sugar-coated stuff at the end of the day. People do want, I mean, everyone wants to be encouraged. That's important. But also people want to know, hey, listen, if something goes awry, how do you avoid that moving forward? I was having this conversation just with one of my residents just earlier, actually earlier today and yesterday, because for Wednesday, whatever the day was. At some point in the case, it was towards the end of it. It was a revision for some sort of non-union, and I had the person put the screw in, and of course, all of a sudden I see their hands just kind of like move, and I kind of knew internally what happened, but I was like, hey, I looked, and yes, the screw head has come off, and this was probably a little bit of an inflection point for the resident because now I could either get very upset, right? Or I could say, listen, like, you have to be careful. You have to be thoughtful about what you're doing. And this is probably where, hey, if the bone quality is really good, and then the relative force as the screw's going in, your torque that you're applying may have been what overpowered it. And I said, listen, it happened, and it was all fine and all of that. And that same resident came back to me, that literally, the fact that you did not, quote unquote, lose it is perhaps, it's something I'm going to never forget, right? They will, and when your senses are heightened, whether it's a stressful situation positively or quote unquote negatively, I think that's when, depending on who's on the other side of the equation, that can really be positively or negatively influential. And so my experience before was obviously not a great one. So I try to, in these situations, when I've seen that, using this recent example as one, well, hey, like, can I be constructively critical about what transpired? And I think that is something that is really important. I think the other element I would say about a good, that's really for the ideal mentors is being individualized, right? What works for one person in whatever the situation may be may not be the same kind of feedback that another person requires, right? And also it relates to skill sets, right? Some people are better with their hands. Some people are better with their knowledge base. Some people don't really know what they don't know. And it is on you as the teacher to help bring that out. And that's why I think the best mentors really try to they really try to dissect out what is the person thinking and where can they make adjustments as to any malalignment in terms of self-awareness or perception of things, with the goal of helping them, kind of getting them back on the path of moving forward through whatever the journey is. And I think that that's another important thing, because I think it's easy, especially in our world, to be a one size fits all. And, oh yeah, like, this is what you should be doing, right? Because in surgery, right, you want to try to do the same thing every time. And, consistency is ideal, especially when you're trying to optimize efficiency. But that's not always the case. Just like, hey, you might have two patients with the same pathology, but exactly what you do for each of them may vary based on a variety of factors. Same concept as it relates to, guiding students, guiding residents, guiding whomever. And I think that that's a really important sort of thing to remember, that there is no two ways to mentor, right? Or no one way to mentor, no one way to advise. There's no one single, it's all, you have to let it sort of, you have to mold it to the person who you're working with, and try to guide them as individually as possible. And I think those who are able to do that, obviously, I mean, humbly, I think probably succeed the most. Uh, that's a very, very good question. So the thing that I get commonly asked is sort of, how do you how do you find balance? And I think balance is kind of like a loaded term, because I don't think there's really balance anymore. And while I might have poo-pooed that notion once upon a time, I definitely think it's about just kind of finding a homeostasis amongst all the different things that are pulling at you, right? Whether it's your kids, whether it's your significant other, whether it's personal obligations, financial ones, academic, whatever. So with that in mind, I tell everyone, I was like, my brain runs like Apple CarPlay. So there is usually multiple apps in my head going on at the same time. And the reason I can say that is because, as an example, my wife and I were talking about this last night. We'll be watching a show, and Netflix or whatever, and I wouldn't digress into the titles of said shows, but she may have started said series, and we'll be a few episodes deep, and I haven't watched, right? But I'll be, putting in orders for a case for the next day just to get a head start, or reviewing an article or something. And then, but I can usually listen as white noise to what's going on simultaneously, while also being able to understand and appreciate what's going on. And in fact, it's probably the function of just being in the OR all the time. And my wife will turn to me and say, wait, so who's that person? And of course, I'm behind 2 or 3 episodes. I'm like, oh yeah, that's so and so. They're related to this person. I'll be able to get. And she'll turn to me like, how do you even know that? and I just say, like, I think it's now just because of the way my brain runs, for better or for worse. With that in mind, because of the stressors that are often pulling in different directions, the need to find a way to kind of sort of maybe slow the Apple CarPlay back, right? Turn it off for a little bit. Spending time with my family is perhaps paramount to that. I would say that's perhaps one of the most important things. So I actually get this wave of like inspiration when I get home. And even though I'm dead tired many times, like, seeing my kids like shout "appa appa," run around, want me to play with them, I get this second wind. And so I think that's perhaps one aspect of it. I think the other aspect of it is, just being able to be there with my wife. And I've talked about her already a few times, but that's definitely a very motivating thing, because I know, she's a nurse practitioner, but she's fighting the good fight at home, battling 2 little ones, on a constant basis. And that's harder than surgery. But I will also say that, so that's like 1 and 2, in no particular order. But then the third thing for me that has become really quintessential is just taking 30, 40 minutes, an hour sometimes, usually I like to, very early in the morning. I won't use any crass terms, but very early in the morning, jumping on the treadmill or the bike or something, to really sort of just decompress. And I find that has, that has been a huge game changer from managing everything. And I think if I wasn't doing that, it would be much more difficult. I'd feel a lot more overwhelmed. And so having that time to just to really try not to think about anything else, but just try not to fall off the treadmill or fall off, my Peloton bike, is perhaps the most important thing, because that's one of the few times my brain is turned off to everything else. I'll say movie, because I'll take that back. I'll say both. So I used to be the reason I'm paused is because I used to be an avid reader, like winning readathons and things like that when I was a kid. Then there's been like a huge lull, like textbooks and everything. And I'd be very cliche for me to say, well, my favorite textbook is an orthopedic one, right? But but actually recently, I came across, there was a handful of books like I went through not that long ago, and there was actually a Stephen King book called The Institute. And interesting, so it's sort of like, hey, just random stuff, but it circles basically. It's kind of like Stranger Things meets Stephen King, and kind of kids with superpowers or some sort of like kind of uh, different kind of capabilities or superhuman capabilities, and sort of like what happens to them in this. So kind of again, very much like a Stranger Things, and I think that it forces you to like, we deal with so much serious stuff. Can you sort of take that step back and that with that notion of trying to like turn my brain off for a little bit, and I think about something just so very different, that you never thought of before. And I think in some ways, when I do that and think about something else, almost like was fantasy or whatever you want to, sci-fi, whatever you want to call it, it forces you to start thinking outside the box as it relates to what we do day in, day out. As I'm sure, you and many other people listening to this, do, just because you have a plan doesn't always mean that the plan goes accordingly. And you've got to think outside the box. What else can I do? What else is available? How else can I, quote unquote, MacGyver this, right? Or, what would my wife do? Because she's always so like handy and in that situation. And I think, or what would some of my like dearest friends and colleagues do, right? So with that in mind, I think the creative juices really kind of start flowing when I kind of see stuff like that, or read stuff like that. And kind of along the same lines, my favorite movie is the Back to the Future trilogy, and specifically part three. uh, I I grew up, I grew up in the 80s, 80s into 90s, and that was definitely a time where literally time travel was this like, fantastical thing. And, the notion of the DeLorean, being the car being used to like travel into, back in the time or forward in the time was just so like amazing, right? And I don't think I can ever forget like sort of what that meant for us, and the kind of is being kind of mindful of just where I came from, and sort of everything I went through as a kid, kind of the notion of, what I was inspired by or uninspired by, and kind of the influence of my mom, kind of leading me to medicine with her passing from cancer. I still remember very clearly running into, no joke, a DeLorean that was souped up to represent the car in the movie. And I was like, what? Did someone buy this? Like, where did this come from? And, it was just, and I still remember like the back of my hand. And so when I see stuff like this or read stuff like this, I think it forces you to not just obviously take a minute in life, but to say, hey, what else can I do? How can I take the most random concept and how does it apply to my day to day? And can I think outside the box of my day to day and not be so confined and say, hey, it's going to be okay. Let me just look at it in a different direction or from a different point of view, vantage point, dimension, even. And I think that those are all things that really, kind of speak to me when I, kind of wade through stuff like that, either audio visually or otherwise.